Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and I am going to talk about attachment today. Now, I have talked about attachment before in a couple of different episodes, but just so you don't have to go back, you can go back and listen to those episodes that I have done on attachment theory, that type of stuff. But you don't have to. If you want to, that's fine. If not, I'm going to start this episode kind of doing a brief summary of attachment theory and how it got started or when it got started, who started it, and just a brief description of the theory. And, I could cite you a lot of different resources, but those are not going to give me a brief summary. Really, what I'm looking for is a brief summary so that we have a foundation from which to talk as we move our way through this podcast episode. So when I'm looking for like a brief summary of different things that I've read, I often will turn to Wikipedia. I know it's not the most reliable resource or the most well-respected resource, but I find sometimes with things like this, with psychoanalytic theories, that it can do a pretty good job summarizing the theory. So attachment theory started in the late 1950s. Sometimes people will say you can really see the beginning of attachment theory with two different essays, I think, or maybe papers that John Bowlby published in 1958. So that's that time period. And he was a psychological, evolutionary, and ideological. He took that approach to this theory that then provided a descriptive framework for understanding interpersonal relationships between human beings. So that's what he was looking at. In his theory, some of this was coming from his own experience, as is often the case. So he was, talking about or looking at or had awareness of maybe a foundation of his own relationships with his family. This is not in Wikipedia. I'm trying to rely on my memory, but I'm waiting for a moment to see if I want to say it. I believe, so a couple of things we get from attachment theory, right? In family systems theory, we talk about enmeshed family systems, engaged family systems, adaptive family systems. Those three are the main categories that different types of families fall under, and that comes from family systems theory. It might have also come from John Bowlby's work. I'm reaching way back in my brain here. And I think John Bowlby described his family of origin as enmeshed. If I am remembering correctly. And, he had moved across the country in order to kind of maybe get some distance or create some boundaries from his family, which, happens sometimes. That's maybe a safe boundary, or that can, space, distance can feel like a boundary. And it is a boundary. Often what happens for people, though, is if they, move in order to maybe get away from the enmeshed system, in order to maybe have different experiences in relationships, the problem with that is that they're not moving away from, yes, they're moving away, they're getting some distance between them and their family members, but what they learned about family systems, what they learned about relationships still comes from that family that they grew up in, right? That had that initial impact. Or, sometimes I'll describe it almost as like an imprint, like it's imprinting on us because it's more happening in our body, in our nervous system, because at the ages that we're developing attachment, the brain is not very developed. Most people will put attachment being developed primarily, it depends on what happens after, but they kind of put it in the, they put it in the first 4 years of life. And then again, depending on what happens after the 4 years of life, if there's a major disruption, if, the first 4 years of life are not consistent with how this parent or this attachment figure was after that, like that's going to cause some problems. But ideally, the foundation for attachment and to have a healthy attachment, a secure attachment, or an insecure attachment is that foundation is created in the first 4 years of life. So I also wanted to, as he gets into the brief description, I think it's interesting what he writes. So just a brief description of attachment theory says, in infants, behavior associated with attachment is primarily a process of proximity, seeking to an identified attachment figure in situations of perceived distress or alarm for the purpose of survival. So again, proximity thinking or seeking is moving towards an identified attachment figure when you feel stressed or distressed. Let's see, picking up, it says, infants become attached to adults who are sensitive and responsive in social interactions with the infant and who remain as consistent caregivers for months during the period from about 6 months to 2 years of age. During the later part of this period, children begin to use attachment figures or those familiar people as a secure base to explore from and return to. Parental responses lead to the development of patterns of attachment, which in turn lead to internal working models, which will guide the individual's feelings, thoughts, and expectations in later relationships. Separation anxiety or grief following serious loss are normal and natural responses in an attached infant. It says the human infant is considered by attachment theorists to have a need for a secure relationship with adult caregivers, without which normal social and emotional development will not occur. However, different relationship experiences can lead to different developmental outcomes. Mary Ainsworth developed a theory. She kind of came along after John Bowlby and worked on attachment theory. So she developed a theory of a number of attachment patterns or styles in infants in which distinct characteristics were identified. Those were secure attachment, avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, and later disorganized attachment. In addition to care seeking by children, peer relationships of all ages, romantic and sexual attraction, and responses to the care needs of infants or sick or elderly adults may be constructed as including some components of attachment behavior. So again, when we talk about these working, internal working models, sometimes, I mean, that's one way that we'll use that language. It's an internal working model, meaning, you know, these experiences that we have with attachment, with the people that we have in our life at young ages that are close to us, that we would be going to seek, you know, to seek a release from the distress or the stress that we're feeling, that creates, you know, these internal working models. Some other words that we use for that, I think I typically tend to use like a map, like it creates a map for our internal nervous system, knowing what to expect and, you know, kind of becoming predictive. So, you know, sometimes we'll refer to it as a map. Another word we can use is a script. Some people use the word script. I think I've used that before. It's fine to use the word script. We get kind of scripts from these attachments that we, you know, maybe predict into other relationships where we are looking for attachment. Internal working model, I think, is maybe the more clinical language. And then there is one other one, I've been trying to think about it, schemas. Sometimes people, you know, professionals in the mental health field, psychologists will talk about schemas that develop from attachment. So again, some interesting things on attachment. I often get asked if there is like a book for the general population that I really like about attachment. And unfortunately, I have not come across one that like I really recommend for clients to read. I know there is a book out there called Attached. I don't recommend it. I don't particularly like it. As a professional, I feel like it would be confusing, you know, these different attachment styles that we talked about, that Mary Ainsworth, she started working on these attachment styles. They didn't have all of those attachment styles, which I think is a problem. If, you know, the theory that was developed includes, you know, 5 different attachment styles. I believe they had maybe 3 attachment styles in that book. And I feel like reading that book, I am making assumptions about the author's attachment style just based on, how they describe the different quadrants, we kind of call them. And I think they combined some of the quadrants, which I haven't really seen that done before. Like any of the things that I'm aware of from attachment styles or attachment really includes 5. Sometimes there's different language than what I use. Sometimes anyway, we'll get into it. But I also wanted to say here, I am going to be pulling up some PDFs. I'm going to be pulling up some PDFs. If you want to see those, I will include snippets of the video with them in the Patreon app. So if you want to see it there, you can become a member of the Patreon app or of the Patreon of the show. Or if you already are, then I'll take little snippets and share those in the Patreon and in the Patreon page app. What do you call it? Anyway, I also, if you are not a member of the Patreon, if you're not a member of Patreon with Thanks for Sharing, no problem. Head over to YouTube because I will also drop the video recording of this entire podcast episode on the YouTube channel. And so you can also listen to it there. That way, if you can, glance down when I'm kind of putting something up on the screen, you'll be able to see it and, have a better understanding of what I'm talking about because there will be a visual. I will try to explain it if you're just listening to the audio. I get it. Sometimes I do that too. I'm only listening to audio, and I appreciate it when hosts of podcasts will explain kind of that they will explain the visual. I always appreciate that. So I will do my best to also explain the visual if you only are listening to the audio version of this episode. But while you're there, if you head over to YouTube, I'm just going to ask for you to hit subscribe, hit like, share the podcast episode, the video, if you'd like, or share some of the snippets. So anyway, getting back to where we're at talking about attachment theory. So like I said, I've done other episodes talking about attachment, talking about family systems. I have all of those in the library. So if you're looking for more, you could certainly go look at those. But let's get back to talking about. So, if you go to Google, there are a lot of different free assessments that you can take that do an okay job putting you in the attachment quadrant where you land. So to start with, let's say there's 2 main types of attachment. So we have secure attachment and then we have insecure attachment. You're going to develop in one of those 2 areas. So then under insecure attachment, we also have 4 categories under insecure attachment. So again, sometimes when I'm talking about the attachment styles, it always takes me back to the first line in Anna Karenina, written by Leo Tolstoy. I have a hard time saying those 2 names together, Leo Tolstoy, where he says, all happy families are alike. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. I think that's pretty word for word. If not, it's pretty close. I don't know if Leo Tolstoy believed in happy families. I don't know that he felt like his family was happy. He's known to have had depression, and while he was successful and, through his success had amassed wealth for himself, I don't know that he was known to be a happy person. And again, I don't know much about his family, but it makes me wonder if he believes happy families exist. So that's an interesting thing, right? I definitely think I would say, I mean, I believe there are some happy families. I believe there are good enough parenting that have happened in families that they are developing secure attachment styles. And I think, you know, each family who is healthy or adaptive, in fact, in the family systems theory, I think they have said, again, they have the 3 different categories that families fall into. So they have in a mesh family systems, there's I would say it's overly close, or I mean, maybe like sometimes people in a mesh family systems or families see their family as being close, but we would say it's not actually a healthy closeness where members are able to, you know, develop their own identity, have their own thoughts, have their own unique characteristics. In a mesh family systems, you know, another way we talk about them would be somewhat of a closed family system. Again, not allowing for outside influence, maybe not allowing for unique traits or characteristics, original thought, like individual thought. That's not really kind of what is known in mesh families or in closed systems. And then you have disengaged family systems. So, you know, similar to how it sounds, disengaged family systems lack closeness or proximity. You know, there's maybe too much separation is one of the ways I will describe it. So it's lacking some of that closeness. And then the third category is adaptive. I think they were hesitant to put healthy with that, which I understand, right? But one of the things they said about, I think healthy just sounds too black and white. And it's not like adaptive family systems don't have problems or don't have issues that appear, right? The thing about healthy family systems is they can adapt. They can adapt to the needs of the members of the family. They can evolve in their thinking. They can evolve. They can be influenced by each other, and you know, members are free to be themselves. You know, that type of stuff. So again, those are the 3 types of family systems, and I think when they were doing their research initially in that area, they felt like the different families were pretty evenly distributed. So, you know, there wasn't like one of those categories that was overly lopsided, like more people were in the enmeshed family or more people were in the disengaged family, or more, you know, we had, this is one of the things that it talks about in the attached book. I think it says 50% of the population, I'm not remembering if it was, you know, specific to the United States, but they were saying, you know, 50% of the population has secure attachment. When I read that, I was like, I need to see those resources, because that is not what I see when I look around at our culture and our environment. And it would contradict what this is saying, you know, where it's pretty evenly divided to a third, and a third. So again, you can go to some of those podcast episodes that I've already done, talking more. I think I did one specifically talking about enmeshed, one specifically talking about disengaged families, and one talking about adaptive family systems. So, okay, let me think if I have anything else I wanted to say on that. Okay, let me get into, no, that's not what I want. So, okay, like I was saying, I was starting to say that there are, and I pulled something up on the screen, that if you Google what's my attachment style, or you know, something along those lines, you're going to find you know, a lot of different questionnaires online that are free. And in my experience with clients doing that and then coming in and talking about it, I think it does a pretty decent job of assessing where they are in their attachment style, which one they kind of have defaults towards. The ones that I use is this one. It's called the ECR, and with the additional R, ECR-R means it's revised. So this stands for the Experiences in Close Relationships questionnaire. So it has 36, I think 36 questions, 36 questions. And you are answering based on a scale of 1 where you strongly disagree, or to a 7 where you strongly agree. So it's a scale of 1 to 7, and it has different statements, and then you're rating how true does that feel for me. So things like, I'm afraid that I will lose this person or others' love. And then you'll rate if you strongly disagree, if that's a 1, if that's a 2, if you're strongly agree or mostly strongly agree, like a 6. I prefer not to show this person or others how I feel deep down, kind of just jump through some of these. I worry a lot about my relationships. I prefer not to be too close to others. I do think they recommend, so sometimes with me, we'll talk about this, but attachment styles are not set in stone, which is good. I think that's good news. Attachment styles are not set in stone. So sometimes it's helpful, if you're having some problems in your relationships, whether that's with a friend or whether that's with a romantic partner or, maybe a boss, something like that. You can also take this assessment specifically thinking of that particular person, or, you can also, that's where that person is, or with others, in terms of just in general, right? The others part would be in general. So, number 4, that's a revised question. I think that was one that was maybe added. Same with 8. It'll put the R next to it. I find it relatively easy to get close to others. I rarely worry about others leaving me. I don't worry about being abandoned. I find that the person doesn't want to get as close as I would like. I can talk things over with others. My desire to be very close sometimes scares this person, or it scares others away. It's easy for me to be affectionate. Others really understand me and my needs. So those are that's a sample of the 36 questions. One of the reasons I like, having like a PDF copy is, and if you're familiar with the attachment styles, you can kind of see which questions would land you in the different quadrants of insecure attachment or secure attachment. And I also like that this gives you, kind of as you're taking this, or as I was reading those different questions, you could have an idea of what I need to work on specifically in order to move me more towards secure attachment. Sometimes I will say, like, again, I've said before, I do believe that there are people with secure attachment. I think most research shows that. Again, I think somebody, if they had a secure attachment, meaning they had good enough parenting in the family that they were raised, but let's say they got into a really coercive relationship or emotionally abusive relationship. Again, they don't really have a foundation to make sense of that. It could make them, like move out of that secure quadrant, move into high anxiety, preoccupied, avoidant, different things like that. Probably not dismissive. I don't know that we would move from secure to dismissive, but just an idea that these relationship styles or these attachment styles are not set in stone. So, they can also vary based on the person that we're talking about, right? So if you tend to be more avoidant, then somebody who also can be very avoidant. And let's say in this particular situation, they are extremely avoidant. You could become more preoccupied, right? The anxiety will escalate. Anyway, let's talk about this. I'm going to get into this, but I like them talking about, so this is kind of the, I don't know how to turn it in my PDF. So this is what I have. But I do have one that is turned the right way. So let's move to there. So Mary Ainsworth, when she was looking at this, and others who have revised the Experience in Close Relationships questionnaire, are looking at these 2 oh, what's it called when you're graphing? Two, I don't know. These two, I need that word. Anyway, the two spectrums, let's say, that they're looking at, right, have to do with avoidance and has to do with anxiety. So that's what they're looking at. Like, what is the anxiety level with relationships or with this particular person? And, are you likely to avoid? Are you likely to not avoid? So this is the language that I use. Again, some of these quadrants have a different names, but kind of similar idea and similar there. I've mostly seen them mapped into these quadrants, right? Which makes sense when you're looking at avoidance and anxiety. So over here, we have a secure attachment. So for those of you listening audio only, think of like just a piece of paper where you've drawn a line horizontally and a line perpendicularly. So you basically have 4 different squares, maybe not the outside line that closes the square, but you have 4 different squares. At the top of the vertical line is low avoidance, and at the bottom is high avoidance. To the right of the perpendicular line is high anxiety. At the low end is low anxiety, or at the left end is the low anxiety. So in that upper square, upper quadrant is how I've always heard them talked about. We have secure attachment, right? So this person doesn't have a lot of anxiety around relationships and attachment and closeness, and they don't avoid it, right? So that as a secure person is also comfortable with other people depending on them or coming to them. That doesn't give them anxiety, and they don't avoid those types of situations. Moving across, staying on the top, but moving across to the right in the next square, we have a preoccupied attachment. And so in a preoccupied attachment, they don't avoid closeness in relationships, but they do have high anxiety. So both of these on the right side have a high anxiety at their base, right? Or at the core. So fearful avoidant people are not more anxious than preoccupied. It just expresses itself differently. It would look different for how they are managing anxiety. So, somebody in preoccupied, and again, I think in the assessment that I have as part of the sexual dependency inventory that we can give out as CSATs to determine the severity, to determine if somebody fits the criteria for sexual addiction, and to what level, the level of severity it is also assessing. And so this is kind of wrapped into that assessment. The ECR is wrapped into that assessment. And so it will chart them, right? So like more mathematically, it'll chart them like, are they preoccupied towards fearful avoidant? Are they preoccupied more towards security? They're not secure, right? But is it like they are very much not going to be anxious, or not, their anxiety is not going to drive them into avoidance, is what I mean. So preoccupied, it's kind of like when you think about people that or maybe this is you, if my relationship is okay, I'm okay. If I feel like, but there's still anxiety underneath that. And I feel like the relationship could become destabilized at any moment. And I might worry about that, or I might think about that, or I might wonder about that and check in frequently. Hey, is everything okay? Are we fine? Are we okay? That type of stuff. So you might know somebody who is preoccupied. Again, what's happening there is anxiety. And I'll get to at the end of this where I think, how do we kind of bridge this gap in relationships? So we'll talk about that. But right now, let's just kind of get into the different styles. So going down, still on the right side, but going down towards the bottom to that quadrant is called fearful avoidant, right? Sometimes I usually call it anxious avoidant. But I understand, we're not saying this one is the anxious one, because preoccupied people also have high anxiety. But preoccupied people have low avoidance, right? In fearful avoidant, they have high avoidance. So they also have high anxiety. So maybe when they feel a disruption in their attachment, or, just talking in general, they feel like, all attachments at some level, maybe I'll be too much, or it's going to have problems, that type of thing. And when that anxiety hits, the way that they try to manage the anxiety is to avoid or to disengage, to withdraw. That's not to say too, Sue Johnson, who recently passed away, I think she passed away in May of this year. May, it could have been the beginning and part of June, somewhere like just in the last maybe month. Sue Johnson passed away. So she came up with a modality of therapy, particularly for couples, that I also trained in, that's called EFT, emotionally focused therapy. And she would talk about, so she divided up, I'm just going to talk about these two for a minute. She divided up preoccupied and fearful avoidant, and she called preoccupied the pursuer and the fearful avoidant the withdrawer. But she also would talk about how for the pursuer, or for this preoccupied person, they are leaning in to try to resolve the anxiety. They're leaning in, they're trying to get close in the relationship, which if they're in a relationship, which with a fearful avoidant, the more they lean in, the more the avoidant distances and backs up from the relationship. And so she did talk about how preoccupied people can, or the pursuer can become burnt out. They get burnt out from pursuing when they're not successful at engaging this fearful avoidant, and they will become avoidant. And I haven't seen stats on likely pairings between these different attachment styles. I do find, I will just say anecdotally, in my work, I find a lot of couples with preoccupied and fearful avoidant attachment styles. I think that's one of the ones I probably work with the most, is that coupling of a preoccupied person with a fearful avoidant person. And again, if the pursuer, Sue would talk about in her literature, in her books, she would talk about if the pursuer gets burnt out and kind of moves into avoidant, sometimes the withdrawer will then re-engage. They would see maybe that conflict or the threat to the relationship had passed, and so then they might engage with the preoccupied or the pursuer who has now become burnt out and maybe shut down. So anyway, there are those two. Again, I think it's important to understand. I also have a lot of clients who fall into the preoccupied quadrant who think that they are healthy, or that that's a healthy attachment style, right? And if you are not in the secure attachment, if you're in one of these other three, or we'll talk about the fourth, then it's an insecure attachment style, right? So, but I do find with some of my clients who fall into that preoccupied quadrant, they do see themselves as being more relational, right? Because they're trying to do all these nice things to try to get this person to engage, or they're constantly trying to show their partner that they love them in order to alleviate some of that anxiety. And, avoidant people don't feel that way. They don't necessarily do that. They aren't going to be leaning in to relationship stuff to try to fix or resolve conflict. They might have some beliefs about, you can't really ever let anybody know who you really are or what you feel deep down, or, you can never get too close to somebody. That closeness starts to trigger the anxiety. And so then that's when they will start to move into withdrawal or avoidance. And then over here on so we're moving, for those of you on the audio only, we're moving still on the bottom, but we're moving back towards the left-hand side. So this attachment style, we call it dismissive. So in a dismissive attachment style, they are very avoidant in relationship. They have high avoidance, but they don't have a lot of anxiety, or that they're not recognizing anxiety. I think, one of the things for these folks, they probably have some type of map, or we would call it an internal working model, that says, I'm better off without relationships. They still might get into relationships, but overall, that's not something that they are consciously aware that they're pursuing, or that would make their life happier or healthier or more satisfying, more meaningful, right? So they are very dismissive of attachment needs, which is why they don't have a lot of anxiety around that, because I would say they're not very conscientious about their needs. I mean, they're still human beings. We have a need for attachment. And that's some of that high avoidance. They are highly avoidant, and they're not even aware of a need for an attachment. And then the fifth one, so here's the 4 basic ones, right? And I think in my last podcast episode with Rachel, we were talking about this. We were talking about myths of intimacy. And I can't remember now exactly what she said about disorganized. It was a different definition than I've ever heard. So I find with disorganized, it's an insecure attachment style. So they're not hitting that secure quadrant, but they can do any of the other 3. I mean, technically all of us, probably if you're preoccupied or avoidant, you might not go all the way into dismissive, because you are aware that you have a need for attachment and you want relationships. So usually I think there's more movement between fearful, avoidant, and preoccupied. Sometimes dismissives will move into, they might have some anxiety, again, depending on, if you can see my little arrow here, if a dismissive is kind of after this mapped right here, I would see that very close. If a fearful avoidant is mapped just over here, I would see them, being able to cross into that dismissive. Same with if they're, kind of mapped here, they could move into that preoccupied much easier, or, there is some familiarity with both of those, probably from a parent or a primary attachment figure in their life. Let's see, was there anything else I was going to say about that? What was I starting to say? Oh, so I was talking about disorganized. So in each of these styles, right, preoccupied, fearful, avoidant, dismissive, the early experiences in relationships that we had, we would see as maybe consistent enough that they fell into a type, right? So they fall into preoccupied, or they fall into fearful, avoidant. With disorganized, I mean, usually these folks have some pretty severe trauma around the attachments early in their life. And, I have one client that I work with, and when we were talking about these attachment styles, he could identify, like at work, I feel pretty secure, and I identify with the way secure attachment is described. We'll get into how they are described. With his wife or kids, both of his kids are adults, he is quite avoidant. There's been some infidelity. So in those relationships, he can tend to be pretty preoccupied. He did talk about, like, if somebody either in this quadrant, even in this quadrant, or down here, gives him feedback about himself, he can be quite dismissive to that person. So again, he's identifying in different areas of his life, falling into all of these. I'm wondering with him, because, he doesn't really report, or he's not flagging high on PTSD assessments or complex PTSD categories early in his life. So it makes me wonder if some of that is compartmentalization that has happened, and who he is in different areas of his life can be different, right? But I still wouldn't say that that really puts him in the secure quadrant. And I don't know that he would either. He's successful at work. And so it makes sense that there's a lot of feelings of security in that area. But because he can land in any of these three, I wouldn't say that, he has a secure attachment, if that makes sense. So yeah, I just want to highlight that again, these aren't necessarily set in stone. Oh, just one last thing on disorganized, and it'll talk about it down here. Talks about the revision that was done. Let me see where it gets into the definitions. So this questionnaire, it says, is made up of 18 statements about anxiety and 18 about avoidance. And that's kind of how they map out where this person lands on this scale. And so it's just saying it's assessing attachment related anxiety. I'm reading right here. For example, how much people are insecure versus secure about the extent to which their partners are available and responsive. Those are kind of the things they're looking for. That would be secure, right? That they believe in relationships that either they are available and responsive, or the people that they attach to, they believe in that availability and responsiveness. In the attachment related avoidance, this will show how much people are uncomfortable being close to others versus feeling secure depending on others. Let's see. Sorry, just taking me a minute. So it says it only takes about an extra 5 minutes to complete the ECRR for each additional relationship assessed. Says be cautious about overlibly classifying oneself or others on these scales. And then it says it is clear that our styles are dimensional and nuanced, not just blunt general categories. So again, they're not set in stone. She says, so for example, I might typically have a secure attachment style with my partner, but I could at times slide into a temporary dismissive style, and that tendency might be very helpful. It says our close relationship style can also evolve over time to become more secure or less secure, depending on the relationship experiences we encounter and co-create in our lives. Attachment style also varies between our different close relationships, and assessing attachment can be very helpful, but be aware that styles are mixed, they're variable, and they're individualized. So again, I think that's a good ending to kind of talking about this, the different types of attachment. Let's see, I don't think there's anything else to share on there, so I'm going to stop sharing. Now, often I will, once we are, I'll do kind of a session introducing my clients to the different attachment styles. Sometimes before they even take the attachment assessment, in our conversation in that session, they, in conversation with me, have a good idea of where they might land, right? They know their life. They know how they've been in relationship. They have a pretty good idea. And typically I do too, because I will say the therapeutic relationship is a relationship. And so I have a feeling, or I have observations of how they have shown up in their relationship with me. And, in the way that I do therapy, I can use that to help them move from whatever their default attachment style is more towards a secure attachment. Hopefully, sometimes I will have conversations with them about how they feel in the therapeutic relationship, right? Do they feel safe? Do they feel like I'm responsive? Do they feel like their conversations with me help to alleviate stress? And then can they start to take that outside of the session and start working on that in their relationships with the people in their life? So those are some of the conversations that I have with them, like these insecure attachment styles that you have developed, they're not going to go away, but we can develop new maps, right? We can develop new internal working models for secure attachment. And, I usually tell them, once we have kind of landed on what their attachment style is, that it's not a free pass to continue being preoccupied or to continue being avoidant or to be dismissive, right? That's not a pass to continue operating that way. For you to be happy in relationships, for you to feel less suffering, for you to feel more satisfaction and meaning in your life, you're going to need to move towards a secure attachment. And so will the people in relationship with you. So that's, I always tell them part of the work that you are supposed to do as a functional adult, which, a lot of my clients aren't identifying as a functional adult when they start therapy. But I will tell them, like, it is your job to become a functional adult. And part of that means earning back, right? I don't think we just wake up one morning and we have a secure attachment. I think that requires work. It requires awareness. It requires being intentional about how we respond, about who we allow ourselves to start being attached to, who we, choose to bring into our inner circles in our life. Because again, those relationships that we are a part of, that we co-create, will have an impact on whether or not we can move back towards a secure attachment or not. Now, one of the things that I talk about too with, hang on, I need a drink, with clients that I have who are identify as sex addicts or partners of sex addicts. Maybe like some of my clients are adult children of addicts. And then I would say the other category is they're either having a ton of relationship distress. They might have been raised by a narcissistic parent, and that has really done a number on their ways of being attached, and how they show up in their current relationships, their adult relationships. Or just, clients with severe childhood trauma. I would say that pretty much covers the categories of the clients who work with me, who want to work with me. So one of the things that we'll talk about as part of conversations about attachment, right? I will also talk about how, as part of our nervous system, how our attachment system works, is designed to work with our threat system. So I'll say, think of your threat system similar to maybe our immune system. Maybe it's part of our immune system, but think of this threat system that we have that's operating in the background. We're not really aware of it unless it detects a threat, but it's just kind of humming along back there, doesn't need us to be doing anything in the conscious. And it's, just scanning our environment for threat or for danger. Now, I'll also say to them a couple of things to understand about how our threat system works, and I've talked about this before, is it operates on a better safe than sorry modality. So it's also going to inaccurately flag danger or a threat when there really isn't a threat. It's also operating on these internal working models that we developed early in life, growing up in the families that we grew up in. So it's, that's what it's kind of got to measure threat by. And so again, that can lead to some inaccuracies in determining threat, but we'll feel it. We might feel our breath get a little bit more shallow, rise up in our body and more into the chest, which is preparing us for fight or flight. We may or may not feel this, but our heart rate starts to increase slightly. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but when I was purchasing the second, so we had a location of Healing Paths in Salt Lake in the downtown area, and I'd been there about a year, and the owner of the building decided, it was just like he had a real estate office there, and then I had this back office, right? I mean, it was bigger. It had 4 offices, a lobby, a bathroom, that type of stuff. But he decided his real estate business was growing enough, and he needed to reclaim the space that I was using. And so he gave me the notification I needed to move out. And so I started looking for another location. This was like in or early, like late 2021, maybe is when he gave me the notification, had to be out by the end of March. And so I started looking for places. Again, this is after the pandemic, but things were, not everybody was back to work. It was just a hard time to find office space to lease. And so the real estate agent I was working with, not the one I worked or leased with, right? The real estate agent I was working with just mentioned like, hey, you may be finding similar situations. A lot of the leases right now are only a year. And so you may have to move every year, right? And it's a lot to move your for office, like the whole business, right? It's a lot to move locations. And so she said, I've been looking at some areas and you might be able to purchase and get a monthly payment that's similar to what you're paying in a lease, but also, own the space. So we started going down that route, and that's what I ended up doing, was purchasing where our downtown office is right now. And it's more downtown than the other one was, like more right kind of in the heart of downtown, which has its pluses and its minuses, but that's where we are. And so I applied for an SBA loan to get some of the money. I had to put a down payment down, and then was applying for an SBA loan to get the remainder in order to secure the funding so I could buy it. And, I called a lot of lenders that she gave me their numbers and was like, call and just tell them what you're looking at, tell them what you need to do, apply for the SBA. And so I did that. And I think I had like 4 or 5 to call. I called, I left messages with all of them. I think I even called a second round, left messages with all of them, and only one ever got back to me. So of course, that's who I used. And it was not a pleasant experience. I've had clients who have worked with the SBA and they're like, it's never been a good experience. And they have more money going into it than I did at that time. And they're like, it still wasn't a good experience. But I felt like mine was also misogynistic, which, was not their experience. Obviously, if they were males, there was a lot of, because I'm the sole owner of Healing Paths. And just one example, like the lender called me and I was at home. It was like later on a Friday afternoon and I was in the office. I think I had an online session, and so I was wrapping that up, and he called right like as I wrapped the session up. So I answered it, and he was asking me like, hey, I need to know like what percentage of the business do you own, right? And I said 100%. And he was like, well, do you have any business partners? And I'm kind of thinking to myself like, well, I know what 100% means. Like, I know if I had a business partner, I wouldn't own 100% of my business, whatever. And so I said, no, I have no business partners. And he was like, what about your husband? Is your husband an owner on paper of the business? No, my husband is not on paper as an owner of the business. He's not on paper with the company, right? And he was like, okay, well, does your husband, whatever, right? Okay. So I finished the call. I get up to walk out of my office. I can see through the windows in the house that my husband's out in the backyard on a phone call. So I just kind of wait. He comes in the house. He was on with the lender who had called him immediately after getting off the phone with me to ask him if he was a partner in my business, what percentage of the business I owned. My husband gives him the exact same answers that I gave him. Anyway, just examples like that where I'm like, okay, apparently, I don't know. But it got to the point in working with this particular lender that my phone would ring, right? And his name would pop up on my phone or on my Apple Watch. And immediately after seeing that it was him that was calling, my Apple Watch would go, your heart rate has risen above 120 when it appears like that you're not you're not really moving. And it would always do that. Like, so I know at some point he became a threat to me. That's just how my nervous system felt, right? I was not like, so I wasn't necessarily, I don't know without my Apple Watch if I would be aware that my heart rate rose every time I saw that he was calling. But my Apple Watch did a really good job connecting the dots for me. And every time I saw that he called, it's like, hey, your heart rate just raised for no reason, right? So again, we might notice a raise in our heart rate. Other things will happen in our body that we may not fully be aware of. I think those are the two that you might notice the most. Getting more shallow breathing. Your breathing might increase, your heart rate increases. But if it detects a threat, so that's one of the ways it works, is it can be inaccurate. It's not precise. Another thing is that our threat system doesn't really differentiate between a physical threat and an emotional threat. Let's see, is there any other thing to know about that? I don't think so. So I'll use an example. Oh, I will also say the other thing to know about our threat system is it's really designed for a single incident threat, right? So let me give you an example that I use. I'll say, so let's go back hundreds of years ago when we're hunting or somebody's hunting for food. And let's say, that they go out and they're hunting for food and they encounter a bear. And obviously their threat system is going to detect the threat. It's going to flag danger. It's going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. Probably not the fawning. And again, that's done very quickly, not even running through the prefrontal cortex, we're not having conscious thought, but we move into, fight or flight. We might run away, we might play dead, go into freeze. And so we do that, we get away from the bear, we're safe, we get back to the people in our attachment system, maybe to our family members, maybe at the time to the small community that we live in hundreds of years ago, back to our little village. And we tell them like, oh my gosh, this is what happened to me. I'm out, I'm, hunting for food. I come across a bear. Everybody's listening so intently on this story. And, afterwards they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're safe. Maybe they're hugging, kissing, like, oh my gosh, I love you. I'm so glad everything was okay. Right. And so our attachment system signifies to the threat system that the threat is over and we survived and we're safe. And, and then our threat system kind of moves back towards the background, operates at a level we're not really aware that our threat system is just humming along in the background, scanning our environment for threat. And that is a single incident threat, right? The bear is the threat. It happened once. It's not like we have this continual angst about the bear. I mean, we might, right? We might have the next time we go out hunting for food, we might be a little bit more startled or skittish. Or, sometimes I'll give the example of a car accident. Again, single incident trauma. We survive. Again, it might impact us on a short-term basis, right? We might feel that, we might feel anxious. We might not drive for a little while, right? We might feel anxious when we start to drive, which is why sometimes people are in one accident and then when they start driving again, they're more likely to get in another accident because they're more anxious when they're driving. But again, those are examples of single incident threat, right? And that's ideally how our system is designed. But you can imagine if we're not separating out physical threat from emotional threat, you could imagine having parents who feel like they're a threat to you, right? They're not readily responsive. They're not interacting with us in ways that are warm or loving. And so, that would be our system would recognize that is a threat. And we may grow up with this belief or this internal working model that the people that I am attached to also will be threats to me. And again, that shouldn't happen, right? If we are growing up in healthy families, or if we could start to, educate people about what is healthy, make mental health more available to people so that they can do their work, so that they can heal and not pass on this intergenerational trauma, these unhealthy, insecure attachment styles. then, we wouldn't have to grow up with this belief that the people that I'm attached to will also show up as threats to me. So, when I'm working with people who have had childhood trauma, complex PTSD, or, they're the partner of a sex addict, I'll also go over this with my sex addict clients to kind of explain to them. And we'll talk about how, we need to, like that, again, our nervous system is not really designed to operate as though the people we are attached to are in our threat system. And, this literature for this, the research and the understanding of the literature really does come out of looking at betrayal trauma, looking at partners of addicts and what goes on with them, right? So sometimes if you're a partner or if you're an addict and you have a partner, they can do some, crazy things. They can act in some crazy ways. And usually this is the explanation that I will give so that we have understanding for the self. If you're a partner, we have understanding, if you are the addict and your partner is in this place. We also don't really call it crazy behavior. We call it safety seeking behavior, right? They're trying to get out of their threat system with this person they're attached to and move back into the attached system. And instead they get stuck, right? Because the reality is this person, their partner, is in the threat system. They did do things that feel dangerous to them, that make them wonder, like, I don't even know this person. And that feels dangerous to us, right? And so we may be operating from this attachment system, thinking our partner loves us, and then we discover something or something gets disclosed to us, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, I am not safe. And that can, start moving into all sorts of behaviors that partners often don't understand. Their partner, the addict, rarely understands, right, but wants them to stop. And so again, this is kind of how we will describe this to them to help them understand this is what's going on. And if you're the addict, your job as you get sober and as you understand addiction and start healing so that you can move into long-term recovery, your job is also to move out of their threat system and move back into attachment system and not keep going into their threat system. That doesn't feel safe for them. That's not something that our nervous system is designed to sustain over time. And then if I'm talking to partners, I'll also explain that to them. And then I'll say, now, one of the tricky parts when we've recognized maybe we recognize that our parents were in our threat system and our attachment system. Now we understand that our partner who has an addiction is in our threat system and also in our attachment system. When this has happened to us, we have to account for human imperfections. Your partner is a human being. They are imperfect. Now, they don't have to be imperfect in ways that are threatening to you. But again, because our nervous system operates on a better safe than sorry modality and can get a lot of things, can detect threat when there is not a threat, we need to be mindful of this. And, the partner has to help us. Hopefully the therapist at our agency, we'll separate that out. We have somebody working with the addicted person. We have somebody working with the betrayed person. And we will have joint sessions with both of their therapists in the room. So all four of us are meeting in the room, helping work on boundaries, work on communication, work on empathy building, all of that type of stuff, before we know or have a good idea of whether or not this relationship is going to endure the betrayal. So sometimes we're also talking about like, okay, it sounds like this falls under the category of human imperfection, right? Let's say, sometimes like some of the examples I'll use, like, let's say that you ask your partner, like, hey, on your way home from work, could you stop and pick up a prescription for me? And they say, sure, right? So let's say one of two things happened. Let's say work was crazy that day. They forgot, they just kind of got in their car and ended up pulling into the driveway. And they forgot to get our prescription. And then we walk in, they walk in the door, we're like, hey, did you get my prescription? And they kind of are like, no, I didn't. And we can respond as though, oh yeah, see, this is the threat you are to me. I don't even matter to you. I'm not important. You don't care about what I say. I don't know if that's actually a threat versus human imperfection, right? Let's run that example a different way and say they did remember to stop and pick up our prescription, but that meant that they were 20 minutes later or 30 minutes later getting home, because when they're hitting the pharmacy at 5:30 at night, it's busy, right? So they're standing in line waiting to get our prescription because we asked them to do that. And they're doing that. They're trying to be mindful. They're trying to remember what we ask of them, right? And they get home and let's say they're 30, 40 minutes late. And before they even walk in the door, we've decided, yep, see, they're acting out. I can't trust them. I can't da 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 da. It doesn't matter that they walk in the door holding the bag with the prescription in it, because in our mind, they're in our threat system, right? And we are responding immediately when we see them as though they are the threat. And so we also have to be mindful, right? Now, I will tell my addicts that I'm working with, this doesn't mean that you get to start using these human imperfections as a way to crazy make your partner or to gaslight your partner. Because again, you need to be moving out of this threat system into the attachment system, which means, we have to start caring about whether our partner can depend on us, whether they can start to rebuild trust with us. Am I worthy of rebuilding trust? Am I becoming a trustworthy person? Am I becoming a more securely attached person? And so again, what do we do in some of those moments, right? Or how do we, let's say that you and your partner are working towards moving back towards secure attachment, but one of you is preoccupied or one of you is avoidant, and, sometimes to avoidance, if one is being more avoidant, the other one can move back into preoccupied, right? Meaning that they feel that anxiety. And if you're more avoidant than them, they start to try to lean in and reestablish that connection. Which, just makes the anxiety grow, which probably makes the person who's being avoidant shut down even more. So usually I will say, again, what bridges us, right, as we're trying to move back towards secure attachment, as we're recovering from betrayal trauma, as we're recovering from CPTSD, any of those things, right, is we need to start learning what I call attachment language, right? So attachment language, again, when we're talking about core attachment needs, things that, responsive, warm, available parents do, they might soothe us as they're picking us up, like, it's okay, I'm here, I'm right here, I got you. That's some attachment language. We need to know, are you there for me? Do I matter? Am I safe? Can I trust you? So when you kind of think of those broad topics that really speak to or get into that core anxiety around relationships, right? Or around threat, around danger. And again, I think it's important that we start to be able to use that genuinely, which means I have to connect with that part of me in there that does care for them, right? That is wanting to show up as their partner and help them get through this moment of threat or this trigger, right? And so I have to connect with that part of me that says, like, yeah, I love this person. Which, for some of my clients, I'm like, you probably need to be connecting with that part every day, maybe 2 or 3 times a day. You need to be connecting with that so that we have mapped that. And that is it's more easy for you to go down that neural pathway of feeling attachment, feeling love, feeling affection towards your partner. And, being able to show up and be a safe person and to use that attachment language, saying things like, I care about you, you matter to me. Sometimes we're having to apologize. I'm so sorry I made you unsafe. I can't believe I did that to you. I never want to make you feel that way again. And I'm here. I'll work through however I need to so that you can trust me and feel safe with me again. Sometimes we are teaching that language. And again, languages aren't easy to learn. If this was present enough in our family of origins, we would be fluent in attachment language. Again, that's one of 5 categories. So if you happen to fall outside of secure attachment, you're going to have to learn this language. And you may have to start talking to yourself that way. You'll have to start talking to the people in your life, your kids, your partner. That's how we bridge that gap from being in threat or being in danger back into attachment. And so again, just kind of talking about that again, those core needs, safety, we have to feel like we belong, we matter, we're important, that people will show up for us and care about us, and that, this person can start to become predictable in healthy, secure ways. That's also ways that we start to move back towards secure attachment. I think when we start to understand and learn the language of attachment, that is a journey back towards earning a secure attachment. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's done. Finished. Until next time, Jackie.